A woman in silk stood at her parlor window and watched a stranger drag a wheelbarrow of stones across her perfect lawn. He stacked them into a ring, laid wood in the center, and struck a match. Smoke rose against the painted sky. Behind her, 12 servants waited in a kitchen that had cost a fortune. The cook she had hired would not enter it. He had chosen grass and flame instead. 3 weeks earlier, on the long porch of the Ashford estate, old Wendell leaned on his broom and said something Beatrice did not hear. She was reading a letter about another cook who had quit. Wendell watched her crumple it. "A house gets warm from the fire, ma'am," he said, "not the walls. My mother used to say that. You can build the grandest walls in the territory and still be cold inside them. Warmth has to be made. Somebody has to tend it." She did not answer. The Ashford estate stood 2 miles outside the town of Haldane, a great pale house with green shutters and a wraparound porch that looked out over rangeland the color of dried wheat. Beatrice Ashford had inherited it 4 years ago, along with the cattle leases, the orchard her father never finished planting, and a kitchen built to impress men who no longer visited. It was a remarkable kitchen. A cast-iron range imported from the east, a wall of polished copper pots, a marble counter, shelves of porcelain. Beatrice had spent freely on it because her father had always said a great house was judged by its table. She believed that. She also believed, without quite saying so, that if the table were fine enough, people might forget how quiet the house had become. The trouble was the cooks. She had hired 6 in 3 years. They came with references and left without explanation. The food that emerged from the magnificent range was correct and joyless. Pale roasts, thin sauces, vegetables boiled into surrender. Her dinners had grown smaller. Her friends, the Wycliffes and the Brennans and the sharp-tongued widow Mrs. Caldwell, still came. But they came to inspect rather than to enjoy, and they left early. Beatrice was 29 and carried herself like a woman 10 years older. She rose at dawn, kept ledgers in a precise hand, and rarely laughed where anyone could see her. The servants respected her and feared her a little. Wendell, who had worked for her father and now mostly tended the porch and the horses, was the only one who spoke to her plainly, and even he chose his moments. Into this came a letter from an employment agent in the railroad town of Crescent, 40 miles south. The agent had a man, an Italian, recently off a long road from somewhere by way of New York, then Chicago, then west. No written references. The agent admitted this freely. But the man had cooked one meal for the agent's own family, and the agent wrote 3 full lines about a single dish of beans, which was 3 more lines than the agent had ever written about anything. He says he will not work in any kitchen until he has cooked outside it once. The letter ended. "I do not understand this and did not ask, but I have not eaten better. His name is Luca Bellini. He is yours if you want him, and I suspect you will not regret it, though you may be confused." Beatrice almost threw the letter away. Then she read the line about the beans again. He arrived on a Tuesday in a wagon he did not own, carrying a canvas roll of knives and almost nothing else. He was perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders, with sun-darkened hands and an unhurried way of looking at things, as though everything he saw was a pot he was deciding whether to stir. Beatrice met him on the porch and led him directly to the kitchen, expecting gratitude. She had rehearsed how she would explain the range. Luca walked the length of the room. He touched the cold marble, lifted one copper pot, set it down. He looked at the porcelain a long moment. Then he turned to her, and his English came slow but certain. "Beautiful," he said, "a beautiful kitchen." He nodded as if confirming a sad fact. "I cannot cook in it. Not first. First I must cook outside on the fire, then we will see." "Outside," Beatrice repeated, "on the lawn, in the open." She had misunderstood his English. She had not. He explained again patiently that he had spent his whole life learning that food made over honest flame, in open air, with time and smoke and attention, tasted of something a closed range could not give it. He did not say the range was bad. He said it was deaf. that it could not listen to the food the way fire could. "Mr. Bellini," she said, "I did not hire a man to build a campfire on my grass. I have the finest kitchen in this part of the territory. People know it. They come to see it." "They come to see it," Luca agreed. "Do they come back hungry for what comes out of it?" That landed harder than she expected, and she did not like that it had. She offered him the position on her terms. He would cook in the kitchen like the six before him, and she would pay him well. He listened with great courtesy and declined. Not the position, the terms. He would take the position. He would not take the terms. "1 week," he said. "Give me the lawn for 1 week. I cook for you, for your house, for anyone who comes. If after 1 week you are not," he searched for the word, "if you are not changed, I go to the kitchen and cook there like a good servant, quiet forever, or I leave. You choose." It was absurd. She had a reputation in Haldane that was already thinning at the edges. Mrs. Caldwell would tell the whole county that the Ashford heiress had a vagrant burning her lawn. The Wycliffes would smile their careful smiles. A fire on the grass, smoke in the curtains, ash on the manicured green her father had been so proud of. And yet she stood in her flawless, joyless kitchen, surrounded by copper that gleamed and food no one wanted, and she heard against her will Wendell's voice from the porch. "A house gets warm from the fire, not the walls." She had not realized she'd been listening. She had buried something when her father died, and the house had cooled around the place where it used to be, and no range, however expensive, had warmed it. "1 week," she heard herself say. "If you scorch the lawn, you pay for the sod." Luca smiled for the first time, and it changed his whole face. "I will not scorch it," he said. "Fire is not careless. Only careless men are careless." She did not yet know how true that would prove. By the next morning he had chosen his spot, a level stretch of lawn 40 feet from the porch, where the afternoon light came clean, and the wind would carry smoke away from the house rather than into it. He had thought about the wind. She noticed that. He built the ring himself, hauling river stones in a borrowed wheelbarrow, refusing help, fitting each stone like a man who had done it 1,000 times. He dug a shallow pit. He laid a grate he had bartered for in town. By noon, a low fire burned, and Luca crouched beside it, doing nothing at all, simply watching the coals form, his face calm. Beatrice watched from the window and felt beneath her dread the smallest pull of curiosity. The boy was the first to come. His name was Sam, 9 years old, son of the laundress who worked 3 days a week at the estate. He drifted to the edge of the fire that afternoon and stopped at a polite distance, watching. Luca did not shoo him. "You stand there," Luca said, pointing to a spot just upwind. "You do not get smoke in your eyes. Sit. Tell me, what grows good here?" Sam, startled to be asked anything by an adult, thought hard. "Squash," he said. "And there's an old orchard nobody picks." Luca's eyes brightened. "An orchard nobody picks," he repeated softly. "Show me." The first meal Luca made on the lawn was beans. He had soaked them overnight in a pot beside the fire, and in the morning he set them to cook slow over the coals with onions. A knuckle of pork the butcher had nearly given away, a handful of herbs Sam helped him find along the fence line, and something Beatrice could not identify that turned out to be a dried pepper he carried, wrapped in cloth like a relic. He tended the pot for 6 hours. He moved coals with a flat iron, banking them, spreading them, judging heat with a hand held inches above the grate. He tasted, adjusted, waited. Mostly he waited. Beatrice came out twice to observe, and pretended both times to be checking the orchard fence. The smell reached her before she admitted she had come for it. Deep, smoky, sweet at the edges, the kind of smell that made a person realize they were hungry without knowing they had been. At noon, he ladled beans into a plain bowl and brought it to her on the porch with a heel of bread he had baked in a covered pot buried in the embers. She meant to find it merely adequate. She had decided this in advance. The first spoonful undid the decision. It was not that the beans were fancy. They were the opposite of fancy. But they tasted like every part of them had been paid attention to. The smoke had gone all the way through, The pork had melted into a richness that coated the tongue. The pepper bloomed warm and slow at the back of the throat without burning. It tasted like time. It tasted like somebody had cared about a bowl of beans more than her last cook had cared about an entire roast. She set the spoon down carefully so he would not see her hand wanting more. "It is acceptable," she said. "It is beans," Luca said, pleased, and went back to his fire. Word of the fire on the Ashford lawn moved through Haldane the way all strange news moved, fast and crooked. By the third day, the butcher had told the blacksmith, and the blacksmith had told two cattlemen, and the two cattlemen had ridden out, ostensibly to discuss a lease with Beatrice, in fact to see whether the rumor was true. They found a broad-shouldered foreigner crouched over a fire, roasting a whole side of mutton on a frame of green wood he had lashed together, basting it with a brush made of rosemary stalks. He fed them without being asked. He fed everyone who came. This was the thing Beatrice could not understand and could not stop watching. A traveler on the Crescent Road, seeing smoke, turned up the drive and Luca handed him a plate. A pair of railroad surveyors. The Brennan boys, sent to deliver a message, who delivered it and then did not leave for 2 hours. Luca asked each of them the same questions he had asked Sam. What grows good here? Who keeps bees? Where is the best water? He gathered their answers like a man gathering kindling, and the next day's food was somehow better for it. Sam became his shadow. Luca taught him to read the coals, white-hot for searing, gray and breathing for the long, slow work, the way ash held heat like a secret. He taught him that you do not poke a fire because you are bored. You let it alone and trust it. He taught him to lay greens directly on cleaned-off coals so they charred and sweetened at once. Sam, who had been a quiet, overlooked child, began to talk. He began to laugh. His mother, the laundress, came out on her workdays and stood with her arms folded, watching her son crouched beside a fire and learn something, and her face did a complicated thing that Beatrice recognized because she felt it too. On the fifth day, Luca took the wagon to the old orchard Sam had shown him at the back of the property. 12 apple trees and a stand of plums her father had planted and never lived to see bear fruit, gone half wild, ignored for years because no one had time and no one had thought them worth the time. The trees were heavy with small, tart, neglected apples. Luca walked among them the way other men walked into a church. He picked one, bit it, closed his eyes. "This," he said to Sam, "is treasure. Everyone here looks at this and sees nothing. They are wrong. We will show them they are wrong." He filled 3 bushel baskets and brought them back to the fire, and Beatrice, watching from the porch, understood that she had stopped counting the days of the week. The apples changed everything. Luca cut them into a heavy iron pan and set them over coals with honey he'd bought from a beekeeper one of the cattlemen had named, and a little of the dried pepper, and butter, and he let them cook down slow until the kitchen. No, not the kitchen. The lawn. Beatrice had to keep correcting herself. Smelled like autumn distilled. He served the apples beside roasted pork the first evening. He baked them whole in the embers the second. Wrapped in pastry he made on a board balanced across 2 stones. He pressed some into a cider that he simmered with spices until the steam itself was a kind of meal. People came for the apples. Word had reached even Mrs. Caldwell. Beatrice's social world was small and sharp, and ruled by the unspoken question of who was rising and who was sinking. Mrs. Caldwell had been telling the county for a week that poor Beatrice Ashford had finally lost her grip, that there was a tramp on her lawn, that the orphaned heiress was being taken advantage of. So when Mrs. Caldwell's carriage came up the drive on the 6th day, Beatrice's stomach dropped because she knew the visit was a hunt. Mrs. Caldwell descended in full inspection mode, lorgnette and all, and surveyed the fire pit, the smoke, the side of meat turning on its frame, the plain bowls stacked on a board, the laundress's boy crouched in the ash like a wild thing. "Beatrice," she said, in the voice of a woman composing the story she would tell at every dinner for a month, "what is this?" Luca, without rising from his fire, said, "You are hungry. Sit there, out of the smoke. I bring you something." "I most certainly will not." He brought her a small plate. On it, a slice of pork with a crust of char and pepper, a spoonful of the honeyed apples, a piece of bread still warm. He set it on the porch rail beside her with a small bow and went back to the fire, without waiting to see what she would do, which was, Beatrice realized, exactly the right thing to do, because it left Mrs. Caldwell no one to perform her refusal at. The old woman looked at the plate. She looked at the fire. She looked, with great suspicion, around her to confirm that no one of importance was watching. Then she picked up the fork. Beatrice watched Mrs. Caldwell's face the way a person watches the sky before a storm. She saw the woman's mouth begin to shape a polite, dismissive word. She saw the word not arrive. She saw instead Mrs. Caldwell go very still, and then take a second bite quite quickly, and then a third, and then look up at Beatrice with an expression of pure betrayal, as though the food had personally tricked her. "Where?" Mrs. Caldwell demanded. "Did you find this man?" "An agent in Crescent," Beatrice said. "He has no references. He has no references," Mrs. Caldwell repeated, scraping the plate. "I should think not. References are for ordinary cooks." She set the plate down and gathered her dignity around her like a shawl. "You will, of course, host a dinner, a proper one, so that the right people may judge for themselves." She paused. "I will help you decide whom to invite. Some of them will need to understand that they were wrong, and it is best they understand it at the same table." It was, from Mrs. Caldwell, an astonishing surrender, and Beatrice understood that the woman had just appointed herself the fire's champion so that she would not have to admit she had been its loudest critic. It didn't matter. The hunt had ended. The story Mrs. Caldwell would now tell the county was a different story entirely. That night, after the visitors had gone and the fire had burned down to a deep orange glow, Beatrice came out and sat on the porch steps, which she never did, and watched Luca clean his knives by firelight. Sam had been sent home. The lawn smelled of smoke and apples and cut grass. "Why outside?" she asked. "Truly, not the speech you give, the truth." Luca was quiet a while, wiping a blade. "In my village," he said, "we are poor, no fine kitchen. The fire is in the open, in the square, and when one family cooks, the smell goes to every house. And people come, and you feed them, because the food is already made for the fire and the fire does not have a door." He looked at the coals. "A kitchen has a door. A door keeps people out. I do not like doors on food." He looked up at her, at the great pale house behind her with all its windows lit and empty. "Your house has many doors, Signora." She did not have an answer. She sat with that a long time. The dinner was set for the following Saturday. 8 days past the 1 week Luca had asked for, and neither of them mentioned the deadline because it had quietly become irrelevant. Beatrice was no longer testing him. She was building something with him, though she would not yet have used that word. Invitations went out. The Wycliffes, the Brennans, 2 cattlemen with their wives, the doctor from Haldane, Mrs. Caldwell, as self-appointed mistress of ceremonies. 14 guests. The whole county would hear how it went. Beatrice stood on the lawn beside the fire pit in the late light and felt something she had not felt since her father was alive. Anticipation, clean and bright. She caught herself smiling. Wendell, sweeping the porch, saw it and said nothing, but he smiled too. Trouble arrived the way it usually does, wearing a coat and carrying a paper. His name was Harlan Pruitt, and he owned the Mercantile in Haldane, supplied half the ranches in the valley, and held a seat on the town's 3-man council. He was a careful, smooth, accumulating sort of man who understood that power in a small place was built quietly, out of debts owed and favors banked. He had supplied the Ashford estate for years, flour, sugar, dry goods, and lately a great deal less, because the new arrangement on the Ashford lawn bought its meat straight from the butcher, its honey straight from the beekeeper, its apples from a tree, and its flour in bulk from the mill at Crescent, where it was cheaper. Pruitt had noticed. Pruitt noticed everything that touched his ledger. He came up the drive on Thursday, 2 days before the dinner, and found Luca testing his fire. He did not get down from his buggy at first. He looked at the pit, the smoke, the stacked wood, the whole operation, with the expression of a man pricing a thing he intends to dislike. Then he asked to see Beatrice, in the parlor, with his hat in his hands and his voice full of regret he did not feel. Pruitt explained that he had come as a friend, that people were talking, that an open fire, that close to a wood frame house in a dry season, was a hazard, not just to the estate but to the whole valley, where one stray spark in August grass could run for miles. That he would hate, he said, to see the council forced to act. Forced to act, Beatrice said. There's an ordinance, Pruitt said gently, concerning open fires within the township during dry months. Rarely enforced, but it exists, and the council answers to the people's safety. He turned his hat. I'd not want to bring it up. Bad business, troubling a neighbor. But if a complaint were filed, and I understand one or two have been mentioned, I'd have little choice but to see it heard. These things have a way of ending an arrangement quickly. Fines, an order to cease, he let that sit. Of course, a household that bought its supplies properly, through established channels, through people invested in the community, that's a household the council tends to see as responsible. Not a fire risk. A pillar, there it was, the whole of it laid out politely. Buy from me again on my terms, and the complaint goes away. Keep cutting me out, and I burn down your week of work with an ordinance. Beatrice felt the old cold come back into the house through the parlor door. I'll consider what you've said, she told him, because her father had taught her never to answer a threat in the moment it was made. Pruitt smiled, satisfied, and left. She went out to the fire and told Luca everything plainly, because she had learned in 2 weeks that he was a man you told things to plainly. He listened, crouched by the coals, and did not rage, which she had half expected, and did not despair, which she had feared. He was quiet a long moment. Then he said, he is afraid. He is threatening. Afraid men threaten. He sells flour. We stopped buying his flour, so now suddenly there is a danger, an ordinance, a complaint. Luca shook his head slowly. This is not about fire. This is about the door he wants on our food, so that everything must pass through his hands. He looked up. What is this ordinance? Is it real? It's real. It exists. He's right that it's rarely used. Then we must know it better than he does, Luca said. A man who threatens with a paper has usually not read the paper carefully. He is counting on you to be frightened instead of careful. Beatrice looked at him, this man with no references and impossible confidence, and felt something steady in her chest where the cold had tried to settle. My father kept every paper that ever crossed this estate, she said slowly. Surveys, deeds, township notices. He kept everything. There's a cabinet of it in the study I haven't opened in 4 years. Luca smiled. Then tonight we read. They read by lamplight until past midnight. The cabinet's contents spread across the study floor. Sam's mother had stayed late to help sort, and Wendell sat in the corner, remembering which year went with which crisis, and Sam fell asleep under the desk and was left there. The ordinance was real. Beatrice found a printed copy of the township statutes among her father's papers, and the open fire provision was exactly as Pruitt had described, and exactly as he had not described, because he had described only the half that frightened. The provision prohibited open fires within the township limits during the declared dry season, yes. But it carried two qualifications Pruitt had not mentioned. The first, it applied to fires upon the open ground, unenclosed and untended. The second, it explicitly exempted cooking fires properly contained within stone or masonry and continuously attended by a responsible person. Luca's fire pit was a ring of fitted river stone. It was never, ever left untended. He banked it at night and sat with it like a nurse with a patient. It was, by the literal letter of the law Pruitt meant to wield, exactly the kind of fire the ordinance protected rather than forbade. But that was not all they found. Beneath the township statutes was a thicker folder, and in it were the original survey maps of the estate, drawn the year her father bought the land. Beatrice spread the largest one across the desk, and Wendell leaned in, and his old finger landed on a thin dotted line that ran along the property's eastern edge. "That's the township line," he said. "Always wondered where exactly it fell." The dotted line ran west of the house, west of the lawn, west of the fire pit by a good 200 feet. The Ashford house, its lawn, its orchard, and the disputed fire sat entirely outside the township limits. The ordinance did not apply to the Ashford estate at all. It never had. Pruitt, who supplied half the valley and sat on the council, and counted himself the man who knew where every line fell, had either never checked or had counted on Beatrice never checking either. The study went very quiet. "He has no paper," Beatrice said softly. "He has nothing. He came here with nothing, and I almost gave him everything because I was afraid of the word. Ordinance. This is the lesson of the fire," Luca said, gathering coals in his memory the way he gathered them in the pit. "People look at a thing and decide what it is before they look closely. They look at beans and see nothing. They look at an old orchard and see nothing. They look at a stone fire pit and see a hazard. They look at a paper and see a law. They do not look closely. Closely is where the truth lives." He tapped the map. "You look closely. Now you have the truth, and he has only the noise." But Luca was not finished, and what he said next surprised her. "Do not shame him with it," he said. "Why not? He came here to ruin us. Because a man you shame in front of the valley becomes your enemy forever. And an enemy with a mercantile and a council seat is a long winter. A man you let keep his pride becomes nothing, or, if you are clever, becomes a friend." Luca smiled. "I have seen feuds in my village last 3 generations over less than this. Better to win the war so completely that there is no war." Beatrice thought about that the rest of the night. The next morning, the day before the dinner, she drove into Haldane herself and walked into Pruitt's mercantile. She did not raise her voice. She set a copy of the survey map on his counter and a copy of the ordinance with its 2 exempting clauses underlined, and she let him read them in silence. Then she said only, "I'd like to keep buying my sugar and my dry goods from you, Mr. Pruitt, through established channels, from a neighbor invested in the community." She let his own words sit on the counter between them. "And I'd like you at my table tomorrow night, as a guest." Pruitt looked at the map a long time. Then, slowly, he understood the size of the mercy. She should have felt triumphant driving home. Instead, halfway up the long drive, she saw the smoke, too much of it, gray and panicked instead of the steady blue of a cooking fire, and her heart seized. A gust had risen off the rangeland in the early afternoon, fierce and dry, and a hot ember had leapt the stone ring while Luca was at the well, and the dry lawn edge by the orchard had caught. A line of grass smoldered and crept, low flames running toward the half-wild apple trees. The orchard, the treasure, the trees her father had planted and never lived to see fruit, the trees that had brought the whole valley to her fire. She left the wagon in the drive and ran, screaming for Wendell, for water, for anyone. By the time she reached the lawn, Luca was already there, and so was Sam, and so was Wendell, and so, within minutes, were the laundress and the stable hand and 2 passing riders who had seen the smoke from the road and turned in without being asked. The same way they had turned in for his food. This was the thing the fire had built, and she saw it even in her terror. A fire on an open lawn with no door gathers people. They came because they had eaten here. They came because the smell of this place had been kindness for 2 weeks, and now the place needed them. They beat the grass with wet sacks and blankets soaked at the well. Sam ran the bucket line. Luca worked the front edge calmly, methodically the way he banked his coals, cutting the fire off from the trees foot by foot, never wasting a motion, never afraid, because he understood fire better than fear did. It was over in 20 minutes. a black scar across 40 feet of lawn, scorched grass, singed fence rail. The orchard stood untouched. They had stopped it 8 feet short of the first plum tree. Beatrice stood in the smoke with her good dress ruined and her hands black, looking at the saved trees, and then at the soot-streaked people gathered panting around her. And she did not feel that all was lost. She felt absurdly surrounded. She felt warm. That was the moment she understood what she had almost been too proud to keep. The dinner was the next evening. She could have canceled. A burned lawn, a near disaster, the whole county primed to gossip. Every reason her old self had ever used to keep the doors closed was sitting right there, ready. Instead, she walked out to the blackened scar on the grass, where Luca was already rebuilding the stone ring 2 feet wider and ringing it now with a broad apron of bare-turned earth, so no ember could ever cross again, and she said, "We don't cancel, we let them see all of it. The fire, the scar, the trees we saved. The truth closely looked at." Luca grinned. "Now," he said, "you understand the fire. They came at dusk, 14 guests up the long drive in carriages and on horseback, and the first thing every one of them saw was the scar. 40 feet of blackened lawn, deliberately left unhidden, with the new wider stone ring rising from the middle of it, and a great fire already breathing orange in the failing light. Mrs. Caldwell arrived first, as a general arrives, and took in the burned grass with a sharp breath. "Beatrice," she began. "What on earth? There was a fire yesterday," Beatrice said clearly, so all of them gathered on the drive could hear it, and no version could grow crooked behind her back. The wind carried an ember. It nearly took the orchard. Half the valley came without being called and put it out with wet blankets and a bucket line. "We saved the trees." She paused. "I left the scar so you could see it. I'm tired of hiding what this house is. Come and eat." It was not the speech of the woman who had crumpled a letter on the porch 3 weeks before. The Wycliffes exchanged a glance. Mrs. Caldwell, deprived once again of a scandal to carry, found herself, to her own visible annoyance, impressed. And Harlan Pruitt came up the drive last, in his good coat, having very nearly not come at all. He stood at the edge of the firelight, like a man unsure whether he was guest or trespasser, holding a jar wrapped in paper. Beatrice crossed to him. The other guests watched, because the whole valley knew Pruitt supplied the Ashford estate, and the whole valley had heard vaguely that something had passed between them. "Mr. Pruitt," she said warmly, loud enough to be heard. "Thank you for coming. I'm glad to have a neighbor at my table." She took his arm and walked him into the light as an honored guest, and in doing so she handed him, in front of everyone, exactly the dignity Luca had told her to let him keep. Pruitt held out the jar. "Honey," he said gruffly, "from a man I supply, out past the ridge. Best in the county. I thought your cook might," he cleared his throat, "might find a use for it." It was surrender and apology and treaty all in one small jar, and Beatrice understood it and accepted it as graciously as if it were a gift between old friends. From that night forward, Harlan Pruitt would be the fire's loudest defender on the council, because Luca had been right. A man who keeps his pride becomes a friend, and there is no war to fight. Then Luca cooked. He had been building toward this meal for 2 days, and the guests, settling onto benches and chairs Wendell had carried out to ring the fire, fell quiet as the food began to come. Not in courses marched out by silent servants, but handed around, passed, shared, the way it had been handed to every traveler and cattleman and surveyor who had drifted up the smoke for 2 weeks. There was the mutton, slow turned over coals all afternoon until the outside was lacquered dark, and the inside fell apart at the touch of a fork, brushed all the while with rosemary and the dried pepper he carried like a relic. There was bread baked in a covered pot in the embers, cracked open, steaming at the table. There were the squash Sam had named on the first day, charred sweet directly on the coals, and dressed with Pruitt's honey, so that the man's own gift became part of the meal in front of him, and he ate it and went quiet and proud. There were the apples, the neglected, half-wheeled, Nobody wanted apples from the trees the fire had nearly taken and the valley had saved, cooked down with honey and butter and spice until grown men set down their forks and simply breathed. And there was the cider, simmered with cinnamon over the coals, ladled steaming into cups against the cooling night, so that everyone at that table held warmth in their hands. Beatrice watched her guests eat. She watched the Wycliffes who had come to inspect, forget to inspect. She watched the doctor laugh at something a cattleman said and clap him on the shoulder. She watched Mrs. Caldwell, who had told the whole county that the Ashford heiress had lost her grip, hold court beside the fire and tell anyone who would listen that she had been the one to recognize the genius of the arrangement from the very first day. And Beatrice let her have it because Luca was right about that too. She watched Sam, the laundress's overlooked boy, move among the great people of the valley carrying a basket of bread, crouching now and then to feed the fire with the unhurried confidence of someone who understood coals, and she watched the cattlemen's wives ask him questions and listen to his answers, and she watched his mother stand at the edge of the firelight, with her hand pressed to her mouth. She watched her own grand pale house behind them, all its windows lit, all its doors standing open to the warm night, and for the first time in 4 years it did not look cold. Late in the evening, when the plates were scraped and the fire had burned to the deep orange glow Luca loved best, the doctor raised his cup and said the table should drink to the cook. They turned to find Luca, but Luca had stepped back into the dark beyond the firelight, where servants were supposed to stand, out of the circle, near the door he did not believe in. Beatrice stood. "No," she said, "not back there." She crossed to him and drew him forward into the light, beside her, in front of all of them, the cattlemen and the Wycliffes and Mrs. Caldwell and Harlan Pruitt and the doctor and the boy's mother. "This is Luca Bellini," she said. "He came to me with no references and one impossible idea, that food belongs to flame and open air and honest hands, and that a house gets warm from the fire, not the walls." Her voice caught just slightly on the last words, because they were Wendell's words, because they were true. He was right. He has been right about everything, including me. She lifted her cup. The whole valley lifted theirs. And Luca Bellini, the cook who had refused her kitchen, stood in the firelight he had built on her lawn and finally, at the very center of the warmth he had made, let himself be seen. A year later, a woman in a plain work dress stood at her parlor window and watched the fire on her lawn, and did not stay at the window long, because she would rather be out at it. The stone ring was permanent now, broad and beautiful, with benches around it, and a young apple tree planted at the edge of the old burn scar, already taking root. Smoke rose steady and blue against the evening. Sam tended the coals. Travelers on the Crescent Road still turned up the drive when they saw it, and were still fed. Behind her, the great house stood with every door open. It was no longer cold. Warmth, she had learned, is not a thing you own. It is a thing somebody tends. She went out to tend it.